Niagara Falls draws millions each year, but behind the mist and camera flashes lies a history of sudden, silent tragedies. These are the final moments of ordinary visitors whose lives ended in the shadow of one of nature's most watched landmarks. It was May 16, 2015, on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. The viewing area near Horseshoe Falls was crowded with weekend tourists holding ponchos and phones. Light rain earlier in the day had left a thin slick on the concrete. The railings were wet, and the floor near the edge showed dark green streaks of algae along the lower edges. Signs marked a safe viewing distance, but most visitors stood close to the barrier to get a clear view of the water. Among them was Lena Ward, a 27-year-old amateur photographer from Ohio. She carried a tripod strapped to her backpack and a mid-range DSLR camera. According to a few visitors later, she mentioned she wanted a photo without the metal rail bar in the frame. She stepped just past the yellow caution marking, placing her tripod on a section closer to the fall line. Some people nearby watched her kneel briefly to adjust her lens. A child nearby watched her set up and seemed curious about whether she was a professional, and she let out a brief laugh without responding. Mist from the falls drifted across the platform, coating everything in moisture. Tourists wiped their phone lenses. Some visitors wiped their faces repeatedly as the spray from the falls hit like steady rain. Lena adjusted her camera again and crouched low, trying to line up a long exposure shot. A few visitors stepped back because the stone surface felt slippery under their shoes. She shifted her weight to stand. That was when her right foot slid unexpectedly on the algae-coated patch of concrete. Several people heard the sudden scraping sound of her shoe. Instinctively, she reached for the rail and grabbed it with one hand. The camera bag slung over her shoulder swung forward, throwing her balance off. Her other hand slapped against the barrier, but her grip slipped. In one quick motion, she went over the edge but did not fall all the way down. Instead, she landed hard on a narrow stone outcropping, roughly 6 feet below the platform. People rushed to the railing. She was still visible, pressed against wet rock only inches from the drop. Mist blasted against her back and face. She tried to shift her body upward, but the surface was smooth and soaked. Her camera bag was hanging off one shoulder, dragging her sideways. Witnesses later described her arms shaking as she tried to push herself up. Someone shouted to hold on. Another tourist took off his belt and tried to lower it, but the belt was too short. A man leaned over the rail, reaching his hand out, but the gap was too wide. More people gathered. Some filmed with their phones. Her hands made several attempts to find a grip on the wet ledge, but each time her fingers slid. For several minutes she remained there, arms trembling visibly. The constant spray made everything slick. Some people leaned over the rail and called out, but there was no one on the platform with equipment or ropes. The sound of rushing water drowned out most of the voices. Her shoulders moved with each breath, visible in the brief gaps between the passing mist. Then, in a single moment, her right hand slipped completely. Her left hand tried to hold the edge of the stone, but it slid without resistance. She dropped straight down, disappearing into the thick mist at the base of the falls. The crowd at the railing went silent. Within the hour, staff placed movable barriers across the slick viewing section. Visitors who arrived later found the rail taped off, with wet footprints still visible where people had crowded moments earlier. The rest of the platform stayed open, but no one stepped near the algae-coated edge again. It was August 7, 2016, when 3 co-workers from Buffalo took rented kayaks onto the lower Niagara River. The water looked calm near the launch area, with a steady downstream flow that seemed manageable for casual paddling. Evan Ross, 33, worked warehouse shifts and spent most weekends at home, but he agreed to the trip after one of his co-workers found a route listed as moderate on a tourist map. They put on basic flotation vests from the rental kiosk and pushed off from a quieter section upriver to avoid the main group of tourists. For the first stretch, the current carried them smoothly. They drifted past rock-lined banks where patches of foam collected against the edges. The 2 co-workers paddled in front, their voices carried off by the steady slap of water against their kayaks. Evan followed slightly behind, adjusting the straps of his vest and trying to correct his steering when the current pushed him sideways. The river ahead narrowed slightly, and the surface changed from smooth flow to rougher, broken water. They entered further upriver than most guided tours typically recommend. This section fed directly into a faster channel formed by an uneven rock shelf beneath the surface. One of the coworkers noticed the shift in water texture and tried to paddle left into a calmer pocket. Evan attempted the same maneuver, but the current caught the back end of his kayak before he could turn fully. A strip of fast-moving water from the center current forced his kayak sideways. The back of Evan's kayak struck a protruding rock just beneath the surface. The impact spun the kayak and pushed it broadside against the current. The force pinched it between the rock and the flow of the river. Water rushed around both sides of the hull, pressing it hard against the stone. Evan stayed upright, but only because the pressure of the current held the kayak in place like a clamp. The two co-workers paddled toward him, but stopped short when the current pulled at the front of their kayaks. One of them tried to angle closer, but the river pushed him offline immediately, forcing him to back away to avoid tipping. They threw a paddle toward Evan in an attempt to give him something to grip, but the current swept it downstream. Evan tried to push off the rock with his hands, but the force of the water made it impossible to break free. His kayak stayed jammed sideways, and his body shifted with each surge of current. For several minutes, he remained stuck in the same position, half submerged up to the chest as the river pounded against him. The pressure pinned him so firmly that each attempt to push off looked slow and limited. Water spray hit his face repeatedly, and his arms moved with less control as time passed. The two co-workers stayed in the eddy zone, unable to approach without risking capsizing. A few hikers on the riverbank noticed the scene and moved closer to the water's edge. But the distance and current left no safe path for intervention. The river continued pressing the kayak sideways until the hull shifted slightly. In one movement, the force pulled him downward into a deeper flow. His hands remained on the kayak's edge for a moment before slipping under. The kayak stayed pinned against the rock, but he did not resurface again. By late afternoon, the section of river where his kayak remained jammed was marked off with temporary tape by park staff. Rangers redirected foot traffic along the bank, guiding people away without offering details. The two co-workers stayed seated on the ground near the edge, silent and unmoving, watching the bright hull still pinned against the rock as the current pressed against it without change. A few hikers slowed as they passed, pausing at the tape before being asked to keep moving. The river activity shifted. Kayak renters returning to the launch were told that the upper section was no longer open for casual use that day. Staff members stood spaced out along the bank, watching the water rather than speaking. Later in the evening, a small recovery craft moved downstream, and a body was seen caught against debris near a bend where the water slowed. It was February 11, 2016. At Terrapin Point on the American side of Niagara Falls. Temperatures had stayed below freezing for several days, causing mist from the falls to freeze on contact across railings, pathways, and exposed ground. The viewing platforms were open, but sections near the edge had been partially barricaded with posted signs warning of unstable ice. Snow from earlier in the morning had drifted over the lower part of the caution markers, making the barrier look less defined than usual. Only a few visitors were scattered around, moving slowly along the icy paths. Among them were 3 art students carrying camera bags and lightweight tripods. Mia Faris, 24, had traveled with 2 classmates to capture winter shots of the partially frozen falls for a college exhibit. They noticed a stretch of snow-covered ground that extended slightly beyond the barrier line, appearing firm and level. The mist had frozen over that section, forming a smooth white sheet with no visible cracks. They stepped beyond the marked zone, assuming the ground was solid beneath the layer of packed snow. They positioned their cameras and crouched to line up shots of ice forming along the edge where water vapor met cold air. From their viewpoint, the surface appeared stable, blending with the rest of the platform. One of Mia's classmates moved closer to frame the falls with the ice shelf in view. The area was quiet except for the deep drone of water below, and occasional wind sweeping snow across the open ground. Mia took several steps forward to adjust her angle. The ice beneath her looked no different from the rest, but beneath it lay a hidden air pocket formed by water freezing unevenly over trapped mist. When she shifted her weight, the surface gave way without warning. The ice cracked with a quick, sharp sound, and her legs broke through immediately. She dropped waist-deep into the freezing water. The break in the ice widened just enough for her body to slip further. As she struggled to pull herself up, the pressure of the surrounding ice caused the broken sheet to tilt. In one motion, the opening widened just enough for her to slide fully under, The sheet then settled back into place, closing most of the gap. Only a thin, jagged seam remained on the surface. Under the ice, her classmates could see a faint blur of movement. The water beneath was dark, moving in a slow circulation under the ice while the main flow roared further out. They tried to stomp on the surface to break through, but each impact caused cracks to spread outward without punching through in one spot. Snow and ice chips scattered with each attempt, but the main sheet held. They used their boots and camera tripods to strike the surface, but the ice flexed and fractured in separate directions. Beneath the thin layer, they could see her shape move erratically, pressing upward. Air bubbles traveled under the ice before disappearing into the cracks. For several minutes, they kept scraping at the surface, but the ice continued to break in wide patterns rather than a single opening. Each time they struck, the fractures spread too far to focus their effort. The blur beneath the ice became slower and harder to track. Movement under the surface eventually stopped, leaving only distorted water shifting beneath the sheet. By late afternoon, park staff marked off the area with temporary cones and rope. Visitors who arrived later found the section near the edge redirected, with fresh footprints frozen into the snow leading up to the taped zone. The surface where she had fallen was already dusted with a thin layer of new snow, blending back into the white ground, until only the barrier line hinted that something had happened there. It was March 3rd, 2017, along the restricted service route beside the Niagara Power Control Channel. The upper channel fed directly into the control dam, where water flowed in a steady force toward the intake gates. Cold weather earlier that week had caused expansion cracks in the maintenance grates, and ice melt from the morning left a thin layer of moisture across the metal surface. The area was closed to public access, with only subcontracted maintenance crews working along the narrow service path that ran beside the channel. David Hampshire, 41, moved along the path wearing a standard maintenance harness and a tether clipped to a waist loop. He had been assigned to check sensor housings along the fence line and note any irregularities in the water readout panels. His tool belt hung slightly off-center, shifting with each step. The walkway was narrow, made of grated metal panels designed to allow drainage, with sections patched from previous winter damage. He paused near one of the intake monitoring stations and adjusted the strap of his belt. As he shifted his weight, one of his boots pressed down on a section of the grate that had been weakened by ice damage the week before. The metal flexed under his weight and gave way just enough for his foot to slip through. The sudden drop in balance pulled his body forward toward the channel below. The tether attached to his waist caught tension and twisted as he fell, stopping him from dropping fully into the water, but swinging him sideways toward the intake. The channel's current pulled at him immediately. As he struck the grate surface beside the intake gate, the force of the water pressed him forward. His chest made contact with the mesh, and the steady flow locked him in place like pressure against a wall. Water rushed around his sides, dragging at his arms and clothing. A co-worker further down the path saw the fall and moved toward him, but stopped when the current pulled debris past the intake, indicating how strong the flow had become near the gate. David tried to push off the grate with his hands, but the pressure of the water held him flat, making any movement minimal. The tether line, twisted from the fall, prevented him from rotating his body away from the current. From the walkway, he remained clearly visible, pinned against the metal mesh with water forcing his body into the frame. For nearly a minute, his arms moved in slow attempts to press away from the intake, but each motion was pushed back by the continuous flow. The surface water carried small pieces of ice and leaves past him in a steady stream. The co-worker held position a few steps back from the intake boundary, unable to move closer without risking being pulled in. The roar of the channel drowned out any sound beyond the machinery hum and water impact. The intake continued pulling water at full force. The pressure against his torso remained constant until his movement slowed. Within moments, he became still, held in place only by the current and the tether line that had tightened against the walkway rail. Once the intake crew confirmed no movement at the gate, the maintenance path was sealed off with temporary fencing and caution tape. Staff redirected workers to a different route farther from the channel. His hard hat remained lodged against the grate, turning slowly in the current as the water continued to push through the intake without interruption. It was September 10th, 2017, at Prospect Point on the American side of Niagara Falls. The night before had brought steady rain, leaving the viewing paths damp and the soil near the railings soft. Visitors moved slowly along the walkway, stopping to take photos through the mist as wind pushed spray back toward the crowd. The ground near the edge showed dark patches where water had collected, and sections of soil looked uneven where runoff had washed across it. Jordan Peters, 29, a remote tech worker from New Jersey, carried a compact drone case and a slim controller. He had flown drones through state parks and posted footage online, often ignoring posted no-fly guidelines in search of better aerial angles. He set the drone on the ground near the rail, then launched it upward. The machine lifted steadily, its propellers cutting through the mist as it rose above the viewing platform. A few bystanders looked up, watching the blinking lights vanish briefly into the haze before reappearing against the pale sky. Jordan held the controller in both hands, eyes locked on the live feed screen. To maintain a direct signal path to the drone, he stepped closer to the rail, leaning forward slightly. The soil beneath him was darker than the rest, softened by water that had seeped down from the pavement edge. People nearby heard the constant buzz of the drone's rotors overhead, a steady sound that blended with the distant roar of the falls. He shifted his stance, planting one foot closer to the edge to keep the drone within his line of sight. The ground gave a sudden, subtle sag beneath his weight. Without warning, the edge gave way in one break. Jordan's foot went straight through the softened ground, and the sudden drop pulled his weight forward before he could brace. He grabbed for the rail with one hand, but the controller in his other limited his reach. The wet surface offered no grip. As he lost footing completely, the controller slipped from his hand and hit the pavement near the rail before he went over the edge. He landed on a lower slope just beneath the railing, hitting the moss-covered surface and sliding immediately. The angle of the slope and the slick layer of wet vegetation carried him down toward the river feed. By the time he reached the water, he had rotated onto his side. Several tourists rushed to the railing and looked down. From above, he was visible a few yards out, floating on his back, one arm partially raised above the surface. The current near the feed pulled laterally, catching him and dragging him sideways. He surfaced twice in the churning water, his head visible briefly among the foam. Mist from the falls pushed across the area, obscuring him from view each time he dipped below the surface. On the final pass, only the top of his arm showed before the water pulled him into the faster channel downstream. The drone remained in flight above the platform, hovering steadily as it maintained its preset altitude. Its rotors buzzed against the sky, holding position over the viewing area. The live feed showed only shifting clouds of mist and pale sky, with occasional flashes of water below when the camera angle adjusted. The controller remained on the pavement near the rail. Soon after, park staff quietly redirected foot traffic away from the section of rail where the soil had collapsed. Temporary tape and cones were placed along the soft ground without announcement. The drone was retrieved by staff and stored with the other collected equipment behind the restricted line. Later in the day, a body was recovered downstream near a slower section of the current. His family was contacted but made no public statement. It was July 19, 2018, during peak tourist hours at the Maid of the Mist boarding platform on the American side of Niagara Falls. The sky was overcast, but the river glare still cut through the mist rising from the base of the falls. The boarding deck was wet, coated with a thin sheen from constant spray. Streams of water ran between the sections of rubber matting, collecting around the drainage grates along the rail. Visitors wearing blue ponchos moved in tight rows toward the loading area as the next group prepared to step aboard. Harrison Cole, 36, a graphic designer from Indiana, stood among them with his wife and young son. They had been issued standard ponchos like everyone else, the plastic material clinging to their clothes from the moisture in the air. Harrison was not a confident swimmer, but he showed no visible concern as the crowd advanced. He moved closer to the railing to guide his son around a puddle collecting at the edge of the boarding zone. As the Maid of the Mist shifted in position against the dock, a sharp gust of wind pushed spray across the deck. Several passengers flinched and stepped back as the mist hit them in a sudden wave. The wet rubber underfoot turned slick in that moment, and a few people adjusted their footing to stay balanced. Harrison stepped back slightly to shield his son from the water. As he did, his heel caught against the metal grate near the rail. The grate had a raised edge from constant water erosion, and his foot snagged for just a moment. The boat began its reverse movement away from the dock, line slackening as it drifted out. Harrison lost balance from the caught heel and fell sideways toward the rail. Instinctively, he reached out, and his arm slipped through the gap between the steel bars. His forearm wedged firmly, The rest of his body pitched outward as the boat continued to move. Within seconds, his torso hung over the edge, half in the water, as the vessel gained distance from the platform. The forward motion created a pull that dragged him along the rail. His arm twisted between the bars. His legs scraped against the deck briefly before his lower body lifted over the edge. People nearby moved back from the railing as his body remained suspended, held only by the trapped arm. Water from the river splashed against his chest as the churning wake built beneath him. His free hand pressed against the railing frame, but the pressure from the movement kept him from pulling up. The boat continued its outward shift, increasing the angle of his body. The force of the water striking his side grew stronger, lifting him further from the platform edge. His arm, still stuck in the metal gap, held for several seconds more before a shift in the boat's motion caused it to slip free. In one movement, his body dropped fully into the wake behind the vessel. From the deck, he was visible for a short moment, floating on his back between patches of white foam. The blue poncho spread across the surface like a sheet, its hood catching air as the water pulled him backward. The current behind the moving boat created a strong draw, pulling everything in its path toward the rear channel. He surfaced twice more, each time momentarily visible through the spray. On the final sighting, only the poncho was clearly seen. The boat maintained its course. The wake behind it settled slowly, leaving only small ripples where the poncho had been visible seconds earlier. Harrison's wife stepped toward the crew rail, speaking to a staff member while their son stood beside her. No announcement was made, and passengers kept their distance from the barrier. Crew members remained stationed along the rail, looking out over the current without giving instruction. Later, a recovery unit located a body downstream in a slower section of water and confirmed a match to the passenger. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, watch more.